Welcome to the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Greene, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change. All right. Well, today I thought I would bring up a topic that comes up a lot in my practice, my personal practice, and also in Red Beard Somatic Therapy, which is about multi-modal treatment strategies. And what I wanted to kind of share is sort of a little bit the history of how Red Beard Somatic Therapy has sort of pulled together a number of different ways of working, which we view as all being connected to the ways that we help people with the kinds of work we do in somatic therapies. Sometimes people come into our practice and they look at the sort of the list of the things we do, and they think, well, geez, I don't know where to start. A very common kind of a thing. And so a big part of our process here at Red Beard is, typically speaking, one of us, often me, meets with the new client and just shares a little bit about what the different approaches are. Here's the story of what's bringing a person to somatic work in the first place. And from there, we kind of make a decision about sort of what's going to be our entry point in working with them. But I thought it might be interesting for you guys if I share a little bit about how my own practice developed and sort of why I tend to think in a very sort of multimodal way. So that's what I was going to cover here today. So if I go backwards in time to my original therapeutic approach, it's when I began using structural integration bodywork. And if you've watched other podcasts or my story, I had sort of done other work and originally I came to my work as sort of an extension of my Zen training. I'd been involved in Zen training and martial arts training, and I discovered bodywork, and it had a big impact on me. I came to it initially in some ways for pain. Could I work out an imbalance in my hips that was causing me pain and in different situations? So on the one hand, that was the first thing that I hoped was going to be addressed. But in reality, it was so much more than that. It did address that issue for me, but what really kept me in it and made me decide to that this was going to be my work in the world was more of the psycho-emotional, even spiritual dimension. So there were, and I've shared about that in other podcasts, that for me, the early days of bodywork, it was a huge opening for sensing more of my body in a felt sense way, getting connected to my emotional life in ways that I hadn't previously, getting connected to, in a way, sort of, I would consider more the more multifacets of my personality and just the dimensions of who I am. And so to me, that was the big discovery. And so when I began my work in Madison, Wisconsin, and my initial approach was that structural integration bodywork. And it's that style of working, it comes out of the Rolfing tradition originally, and it's known for being a fairly deep approach. So we're using pretty firm pressure and touch, working in the muscles and the connective tissue and separating things. And compared to people who've had a lot of experience with massage or therapeutic massage, relaxation massage, it's sort of like, wow, this is different. And even even within the massage world, there's deep tissue massage, and there's some crossover between structural integration work and deep tissue, and there's also some differences. I think a common thing I hear from people who are launching into structural integration work is, wow, this sort of recalibrates my understanding of what hands-on work is. Not only because it's fairly deep. I mean, there's times when there's a lot of sensation, aka a little bit of pain. So it's not only that, but it's also how interactive it is. There's just the common experience in massage is you're draped and you kind of kick back and tune out, and the person does their thing. Totally valuable. I like that kind of work. Whereas with what I now call Zen integration bodywork, that's my distillation of the structural integration work. When we're working in that format, you're not just kicking back and relaxing. It's a collaborative. Both the practitioner and the client, their sort of full attention is on the process at hand. Anyway, I'm a little bit digressing for a minute. So what I wanted to share is that, I began my work, and as I was working with clients, I couldn't help but be curious about, okay, well, I learned a set of techniques that's very powerful. It's creating a lot of change for people in terms of their structure, kind of like their posture, how they move. So a lot of changes in that regard. Many people are reporting that their mood is changing. The flow of their emotional energy is there. Their depression is lifting. Some of the same experiences that I had. So I'm hearing the feedback around the psycho-emotional evolution. They're remembering things. They're connecting the dots with. They're realizing that how they're approaching their job is. They need to step into a new chapter. All these kinds of stories of transformation, which can come up. But naturally, I became curious about. I had trained in one modality, but there's so much out there. And if you're in this industry at all of bodywork, somatics, wellness, you realize quickly that, man, there's so many things. There's acupuncture, there's massage, there's Feldenkrais method, there's Reiki, there's a bazillion. There's a bazillion things, and so I knew that I couldn't. I wasn't just going to study all those bazillion things, and I wouldn't need to. There's a lot of overlap with all of them. But what started to guide me was that when I started having a question in my work, if something was coming up and I wondered, hey, what do we know about that phenomenon? What do we know? Is there any modality that gives a theory for this or provides some methods? So that was sort of how I approached my own sort of adding in modalities over about a decade's period. And in some ways, I could look, I could criticize myself as saying, okay, well, you can't learn everything. And that's totally 100% true. So I had to, but my approach was sort of get a lot of deep practice in one modality. For me, that was the structural integration bodywork. And then pick a piece when I really had a genuine question, something I really needed to have more information to fill in what I was sensing, feeling, and seeing in the bodywork treatment environment. And so I'll just share a little bit of those stepping stones along my own way, just for if anyone's curious about kind of what guided my own learning. And so in a way, it's a while ago. I got to remember what my sequence was. But I guess in some ways, so, I'm starting with bodywork. And one thing I quickly learned was that on the psycho-emotional side of touch work, in terms of what were the conditions such that somebody was going to touch into something meaningful for them, maybe like an important memory, good, bad, neutral, or access some emotional process come in. And what I started to recognize was that there were sort of known areas where that might happen. And an example of that many people in the bodywork and somatic world know about is deep in the core and the psoas muscles. It almost becomes a joke sometimes. It's like, oh, everything's in the psoas. But and I would argue that not everything is in the psoas, but a lot is in the psoas. It's an important area at the structural level, and it's a very important area at the emotional and perhaps even spiritual level as well. And if you don't know what they are, the psoas muscles are your deep hip flexors, and they attach on the front surface of your lumbar spine, and then they cross over your hip joint to the top of your leg. And it'd be the muscle that you'd use if you were lifting up your knee to like step up the stairs, for example. But it has many other functions than that. It controls your postural alignment and things like that. And it's related to another muscle, the iliacus, which lines the inside of your pelvic basin. And together, the psoas and the iliacus form the iliopsoas. Anyway, getting a little too technical here. Coming back to my idea, so what I started to discover is there's sort of certain known areas, working in the belly, working in the pelvis, where, it just was so common. Not always, it's never always, but that would be an important thing to restore a sense of connection to self, accessing trauma sometimes, releasing of grief, these sorts of things. Working in the chest and opening up the breathing through the rib cage was also another time when people might spontaneously have connecting to something deep within them. So I started to see that there's some common things, but there's always surprises. But part of what I started to recognize was that sometimes it was when I was working with, depth, sort of pressure, sustained touch, going a little bit more deeply into a muscle group than other modalities might do. And that was something that really stands out about Zen integration bodywork or structural bodywork, is that there's times when we really go to a level of depth within, of course, the tolerance of the person. It's not about, torturing them or something like that. But when the person is there with you, we can go to a level of depth and intensity of sensation that's unusual in other types of body work. And for that reason, we're sometimes contacting and accessing content, material, psycho-emotional content that you might not get through a relaxation massage or a deep tissue massage. But I also started to recognize that there were times that even though depth and intensity sometimes was the thing that unlocked for the person, there were also times when it was just the most delicate touch. It was the lightest touch. And so I started looking around and seeing that, there are other specializations in manual therapy, craniosacral therapy, myofascial release, visceral manipulation therapy, zero balancing, and orthobionomy. There's any number of other manual approaches that are different than structural integration in that it's a very different style of touch. It's a sensitive touch. It's about attunement. And through that, it's, in my experience, equally, but also different, powerful ways of connecting to the psycho-emotional aspect of a person through touch. So what I recognized was that I wanted to kind of broaden my toolkit and be able to work at different levels of intensity. My background, this is how I used to conceptualize this. Before I ever did body work, I spent about 5 years primarily doing woodworking and home construction. I was really interested in natural building, and that was my work between 2005 and 2010 or so. And the analogy I made as I was deepening my practice of body work was that when attending to the human body and the person, there's many levels, and the analogy I'd make was with carpentry. It's like, you need to know how to lay a foundation, which is heavy equipment, big machinery, forming the footings with concrete. And then there's, the structural phase, putting the timbers or the beams or the wall construction. But then, in the later phases of building a home, there's the finish carpentry and all the artistry that can come up in that phase of construction with more refinement and sensitivity. And my view became that on the bodywork side, what I wanted for myself was to be able to address that whole spectrum. I wanted to be working really deep in structural ways. What's the most efficient way to change the relationship of the bones and the muscles? That can be intense work. But not only doing that, I wanted also to be able to have the skills to work with sensitivity when that structural work wasn't was complete or was needed, wasn't what was needed. So on the bodywork side of things, that's what really drove the evolution of my personal practice, studying a lot of different types of manual therapy. And then when we became a group practice, Red Beard Somatic Therapy, around 2016 or 17, part of my vision was, okay, now we're going to start to bring in other, at that point it was all manual therapy, bodywork therapy, where we have different tools and different experience working at those different layers of the person. So that's kind of one explanation of kind of how I started to feel that getting a big toolkit, but understanding how those pieces fit together is a big part of my approach. Now, for me, with my original interest in bodywork, again, it wasn't just about posture. It wasn't just about getting rid of pain patterns or improving movement. It includes all those things, but for me, there's always the psycho-emotional spiritual component, because that was what had gotten me into the work. And so for me, that was another area where I really started to want to feel, okay, well, how does this layer fit in? Because my view very strongly is, sometimes we use the term body-mind as one word, body-mind, referring to the interconnectedness or the unity of that body can't be separated from mind can't be separated from body, which, many people talk about, especially in the Western world. We have this long history of what's called Cartesian dualism, where we, from Descartes' time on, we a little bit considered the mind as independent from the body and vice versa. So in the somatic world, in the Western somatic world, there's a big part of the ethos is around studying the interconnectedness between body and mind. And coming from my Zen and martial arts training, that was a big emphasis as well. So for me, I really wanted to start to include the mind elements, like what could I learn about the mind side of the unity, the body-mind unity, and also energetic, because from my experiences in Zen training and a lens that we used, it was that it's a bit of an Eastern approach, a Taoistic approach, that we could also look at the universe as energy. And that's true within the microcosm of the person. Within the person is an energetic system in relationship to the energetic nature of the universe as a whole. So that's sort of one big component of Zen, Buddhism, Taoism is investigating things from that perspective. And I felt that bodywork was a way for me to learn about that, and also to help people with that at that level of themselves, the energetic side. So I just to share a couple examples of where, I needed a piece of information, and so I found a tool that would help me with that. So one example is, after I was doing bodywork for a while, several years, quite intensively, even before I was doing it professionally. I think I've shared this before on the podcast. It was just like all I could do for, and with my practice partners down in Chicago, that's where I did my training. Man, we sometimes just did the most the longest sessions. I think one time I received a 6-hour bodywork session. I think I've given like a 7 or an 8-hour bodywork session. I don't recommend these things anymore, but we were at a phase where we were just really, really hungry to understand what was going on in these things. So anyway, after a year or two, I started to realize that like I was feeling different things with my hands. So, I had already learned to feel the muscle tension and, where I am in the muscle and, kind of the texture at the tissue level, that stuff kind of came early, like that layer of sensitivity. But then at a certain point, I recognized that, but I feel there's now I'm starting to feel more than that. Like, and I started to think in energetic language, like, this feels like, there's a flow of energy that's coming towards me, or this feels like there's energy that's dissipating from me. But I was a little clumsy with so I could start to feel a lot, but it hadn't been explicitly taught in my training. So it was a little bit like, okay, well, how do I make meaning out of these differences that I'm feeling? So I got curious about how other traditions explain what you're able to feel in terms of energetic flow when you're working with doing hands-on body work like that. And there were a couple that were really helpful for me, but where I started to get some very, very useful information. And one was, I was lucky that I was in the same building as David Layden, and David Layden is like a national treasure of Wisconsin, a state treasure maybe. He is a Rolfer, and he's also a zero balancing practitioner, and he's been in the same office in Madison, Wisconsin. It's at least 40 years, I think. And he shared with me that when he began his work, and I don't remember the decade anymore, but when he began, there was one massage therapist in all of Madison. There was one acupuncturist in all of Madison. And then there was one Rolfer, and it was him. And which is funny because now if you're in Madison, there's many, many massage therapists, many, acupuncturists and other modalities. Still not very many Rolfers, but more than one. Anyway, so I don't think I ever would have known about this modality, but something called zero balancing, and zero balancing is a touch work that's designed where you are working at the level of the bone. But what's especially interesting about it to me was that you're working with the energy and the structure of the bone. So you're trying to understand how the skeleton is organized, but you're also feeling what's present at an energetic level. Now, so I read a couple. So the founder of this work is this very interesting person named Fritz Smith. And he was an osteopath, meaning, he had sort of worked with bones. And then he was in the first graduating class of Western trained acupuncturists somewhere in London. And so he studied, when the West was becoming aware of acupuncture, Chinese medicine, he studied that. And in Chinese medicine, they have a very developed, over thousands of years, description and understanding of the flows of energy in the body. And many of us who've ever done acupuncture, things like that, there's the really obvious or more well-known what's called meridians, and connecting to the different organ systems, and the acupuncture points and the acupressure points. And he learned all of that, and he was interested. But what he was especially interested in is that in Chinese medicine, the viewpoint is that there's also currents of energy running through the skeletal system. And in Chinese medicine, those are considered some of the deepest layers, and in many cases, sort of part of your ancestral heritage. That there's just there's this idea that in a way these are like the deepest and oldest, sort of currents of energy in the body. Anyway, but what was so impressive, he has two books that are so good: Inner Bridges and The Alchemy of Touch. And she provides the most useful descriptive language for all the things that you can sense through touch as you're touching. In his case, it was touching bone, but in my view, this could be applied to if you're working in the fascial system, if you're working in the muscular system, etc. Things like, when the energy is expanding, when it's lengthening, when it's rebounding. And he provided such detailed examples that really, it was like it gave me a vocabulary and a way to organize what I had already started to sense and feel. So that's an example of where I was working and I started to have a question about how can I understand this more deeply, and then I found a person or a body of work that really studied that question in detail. So I went through that training, and David Layden was my mentor for that certification. And I learned so much about the energetics of touch because that modality did such a good job of describing it and naming it. So that's sort of one example of where I was ready to kind of expand into a different direction. Another example of that is one I don't talk about as much, but it is one that's important to me, and it's about the energetics of the therapeutic environment, but not through touch. So I guess I'll share with you my story on that one. Is as I spent more time with people in these settings, I started to feel, okay, great. I've got a lay of the land, with the muscles and the bones and doing work, and it's making a big difference for people. Awesome. I like that. And I'm starting to learn, and now I can feel more about the what's happening at the energetic level, and I have a better framework for understanding why that's important. And so I'm working in a specific way as I work with this person. But the other thing that started coming up for me is that there's also interpersonal energetics. And I think most of us know this intuitively, that, you kind of spend time with a person and, you influence one another, you affect each other in some way. If somebody's in a good mood, that might lift your mood. If somebody's, we influence one another. And so that's in a way sort of a common sense understanding. But what I found in the concentration and the sort of the uniqueness of the therapeutic environment, where we're there to do, in a way it's almost a meditative experience, where what are we here for? We're here for a deep and attuned connecting to this person and what's needed in their in their evolution, and 90% of that was, for me, I'd started with touch. And so that's what I was doing. But it became clear to me that even when I was sitting, when I was touching, sure, things were happening. But when I would take a step back and I'd sit and I would give that person some time just to be with whatever it was, that there was so much to sense and feel on my side. Like in the sense that when a person would go into a deeper place within themselves, or they'd go into a memory, or they'd go into some sort of emotional process. It's not like I was reading their mind or something like that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am suggesting is that I would, whatever was going on for them, was that somehow I was involved in that, and that they're not through what they were describing, but just by being in that presence in a listening, concentrated way, that there's a connection between that person's experience and mine. And so I started to realize that, that's a whole dimension. There's a lot that can happen, not through touch, or there's a lot of communication between two people that's not at the level of touch. And it was really funny. I met a person, we did a trade for Bodywork. She was a body worker. And then she described something. She told me she was really into this thing called soul awareness healing. And normally, that's the kind of thing I wouldn't, you have to have a filter. Like, you're interested in certain things, you're not interested in certain things. So, that's the kind of thing that I would not be all that interested in my filter. I come from a Buddhist background. We don't use the word soul. That sounds a little Judeo-Christian, which is, a full respect for that tradition, but just, wasn't sort of what was speaking to me. If it wasn't Judeo-Christian, it could be sort of New Agey. So that would have been my sort of impression. But I was curious enough, and I asked her to just describe it for me a little bit. She said, well, basically, you sit with a person, and we could call this energy attunement or something. I think that's a word that is often used. And you start to sense what's happening in their energetic system. And we learn a little bit about the chakra system and we learn principles of helping somebody organize their energy system or, via this, thing. And I thought, okay, great. I knew that was possible because that's been sort of happening, but I don't have any language for it. I don't have any particular tools. So that was another thing I studied in terms of an energy medicine approach. And the guy who teaches that, Paul Ditscheit, to me, he's another state treasure, national treasure, based in on the east side of Madison. And he's a guy with just deep experience, trained under a number of different teachers in energy attunement kind of work. But then he developed his own system. He called it soul awareness healing because it resonated with him. The only book that he recommends is Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Oversoul. And Paul says that book, that essay, The Oversoul, to him is a great description of that, that's something in the backdrop of our awareness that's a little bit hard to put a finger on, but is present. And Paul calls himself kind of a blue collar energy worker, which I love. It's sort of like his philosophy was, all right, how do we make this really practical? There is something there. And so he learned sort of to do it. And then his teaching method is just super practical. So I spent a couple of years doing that work with Paul, and it really gave me the confidence that yes, when there's intention and there's connection and there's consent, we're doing this together, that there are ways to sense and feel what's happening in somebody's sort of background energetic system, and there's ways to be in support of that through your own energy system. So that was another example of where I had a question and I wanted to sort of study that with more detail. Later, so that was kind of on the energetic side. And then my next big draw was towards neurobiological approaches, things like somatic experiencing, TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercises, that nervous system focused approaches. I got really interested, and part of it was that there was just a really interesting emerging science that some of the work like of Dan Siegel and interpersonal neurobiology and others were starting, Peter Levine, David Berceli, were starting to give a really useful way of looking at the role of the autonomic nervous system in terms of this body-mind connection and the vagus nerve and all this stuff. So, and I have enough of even though I'm interested in Eastern, I've been talking about all this, energetic stuff. I'm sort of equally interested in what can we know through science and through biology and neurobiology. And I realized that neuroscience is, and neurobiology is just a quickly evolving thing, and it can also provide a really useful vocabulary for working with the mind body. And the other factor is, okay. So of those neurobiological approaches, I started with TRE, and the reason for TRE, and I've explained this a little bit in other podcasts, but the short version is that sometimes when I was doing body work, I would see people tremble and shake. And when I had first gone through body work myself, before I became a body worker, I had a big spontaneous shaking experience. And I had never heard anybody provide a good explanation other than that's just sort of a a release, no explanation, just. And so when you hear it's a release, it's like, well, is this a religious experience? Is this what is this exactly? And for me, it was really helpful to think of it to recognize that there's a neurobiological component. Now, there might also be a spiritual component. I'm not denying that, but that there is neurobiology at work, to me, really grounds the phenomenon in science, and that's a value of mine. I like having that. And so TRE and somatic experiencing, they both provide ways of working with the autonomic system to help get to that point of discharge. So in TRE, that's what the whole method is about, creating the neurogenic tremoring process, which helps release tension and stress. And in trauma and in somatic experiencing, it's using awareness, guiding a person to sense and feel their body, learn to slow things down, learn to bring curiosity to their breath, to their awareness, to sensation. And through that guided process, the person learns to sense and feel the rhythms of their autonomic nervous system and help it and steer it in the direction of relaxation and grounding and things like that. And one of the reasons, and so actually, this is sort of a funny thing. Part of, I loved those working methods, and I learned so much in the somatic experiencing training and the TRE training. And then and part of what I really liked about it was that it was in a way more comfortable for me to work with clients and be able to offer a neurobiological explanation for, what is co-regulation? Why is my nervous system affected by your nervous system, and these principles? It gave a language to me, what we could also describe with energetic language, but to me, it made it a little less, well, actually quite a lot less sort of new agey, because I sometimes feel, even though I really believe in energy phenomenon, and I think it has a strong tradition in indigenous cultures and in Eastern culture for sure. And so I don't really think there's anything that woo-woo about it, but it can seem that way. And also because the clients that I work with, we all come in with totally different worldviews and frameworks for understanding. For one person, it might be the most natural thing to think that their body is connected, that there's that there's spiritual side is related to their pain or something. And for somebody else, that's a completely crazy idea. So how can I work with these people anyway, regardless of the framework or the worldview, but working in a way that bridges the connection between body, mind, nervous system, etc. So to me, nervous system language became a really accessible way of working and way of explaining what's happening in the therapeutic process. So that's just that's a broad view. I guess I'll maybe connect a few other dots in terms of how I have continued to expand my views about, why did I pick the particular modalities that I studied, and then how did Red Beard Somatic Therapy start to bring in the modalities that we work with. And just a couple of short examples, like, with structural integration, that's the word that Ida Rolf came up with for the Rolfing process, or structural integration, the idea of integrating the structure and then the body and mind from her view, but doing it through organizing the skeletal structure through touch. And a peer of hers, Moshe Feldenkrais, and a friend, a collaborator in some ways, he called his work functional integration. So we got structural integration, functional integration. And what structural integrationists would do is they would mechanically help reorganize the tissue to get a more interconnected body. And what functional integrationists, Feldenkrais people, would do is not use that. Well, they did use touch, but not deep touch. They would work through movement and the nervous system to try to create an integration. So different ways of working, but something connecting. Both of them want an integrated neuromuscular skeletal system, and then everything that comes with that. But very different ways of approaching it. And so when I decided that I had the bandwidth to start to study Feldenkrais method, my view was, I've gotten pretty darn good at seeing the structural relationships in a body and using structural integration techniques to help reorganize it. So that's like, I've been at this for 6-7 years full time, and I'm feeling pretty good in that method. What's another way that I can come in and help the person maintain that, instead of me doing it to them through the manipulation process? Can I also show them that they can do that? There's movement activities, there's ways that they can sense and feel that help them retain it in a way. So that was my big pull towards bringing in the Feldenkrais method, which is similar to somatics. That's what Ellen does in our practice. Was that the helping develop the person's sense of their own movement was another pathway to establishing and maintaining the integration that we do in structural integration. So again, how do we marry these two things together? Another something I didn't realize when I first started studying Feldenkrais, but now I believe, is I see this big marriage between TRE, neurogenic tremoring, and Feldenkrais method. And the marriage is that, to me, what TRE does such a beautiful job at is showing us that that there's all this involuntary movement. So if we learn to stimulate the tremor mechanism, and our body starts to have a vibration, and that vibration can move through the whole structure. And that's not sort of like, we're not deciding like, I'm going to move my head like this, or I'm going to wiggle. It's what's happening from the reflex, from the neurogenic tremor reflex. And what we're doing is we're letting go into it, relaxing our muscles. And then that mechanism is doing the reorganizing in a sort of like an involuntary movement way. But to me, what Feldenkrais does so well is especially the awareness through movement lessons. That's the not the hands-on piece of Feldenkrais, but the classes, is that you're really studying in detail your voluntary movement. So in Feldenkrais work, you're not tremoring. You're doing small things. You're rolling your head. You're moving your eyes. You're paying careful attention to your breathing. So it's about really becoming, slowing down and becoming aware of the minutia of how you can sense and move your body. Sometimes seems a little boring at first until it becomes very exciting. But so to me, the strength of Feldenkrais work is the refinement of your ability to sense and feel and to move within your voluntary control. And there's a lot, by refining that, we can unlearn dysfunctional patterns. We can feel lighter and better organized. We can become more sensitive in our movements, more efficient. So there's all those really good things that happen. So now what I'm really exploring a lot with clients, and I'm developing some teaching around, is that there's real value in knowing both sides of it. What happens when we let go into our involuntary neurogenic tremor? That's this side. And what happens when we learn to refine our voluntary movement system? And my view is that learning both sides of this is a more encompassing way to integrate the body-mind structure than just one or the other. Anyway, at this stage, I feel like I'm running out of time for our conversation. I might have to do a part 2 about how the mind side, because some of my more recent things have been around internal family systems, which is a way of looking at the psyche, and work with DARE attachment work, which is about attachment relationships. So maybe in a future podcast, I'll continue this conversation with why those modalities, how do they fit together with the more body-oriented pieces that I've been describing today. So anyway, that's the news for today. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.